She doesn't feel the floor go out from under her until his hand is already at her throat. 6 guns. One held breath, filling an entire room. She has spent 10 years learning how to be still when she is afraid. This is not that kind of stillness. His thumb finds the old scar beneath her jaw, like he already knew it was there. Then he bends down and says the one word her father died trying to keep buried, and something in her chest she has spent a decade refusing to wake opens its eyes. If you've ever been the one everyone thinks they understand, the quiet one, the careful one, and you've ever wanted someone to finally look past that and see what you actually are, subscribe and stay. You already know why you're still here. The storm had been building over the Sierra since noon, and by the time it reached Carson City it had teeth. Hailie McCall counted her steps the way she always did, the worn leather strap of her violin case cutting a familiar line across her shoulder. 12 steps from the corner. 6 more to the curb. The rain had turned Carson Street into something closer to a river, and her cane kept losing the edge of the sidewalk under the rising water, the tactile feedback she relied on dissolving with every gust. Her boots were already soaked through. She pressed on anyway, jaw tight, counting. Somewhere ahead, she caught the warm hush of revolving doors and the low murmur of a crowd that didn't belong to weather like this. Voices pitched for champagne, not survival. A hotel. Carson Crown, maybe, though she'd never been inside it. She didn't need to see the building to know what kind of place sounded like that. Marble, money, the particular silence of rooms built for people who never had to run from anything. She pushed through the doors anyway. The wind lost its grip on her all at once, and the sudden quiet of the lobby pressed against her ears like a hand. She stood there a moment, dripping, breathing hard, letting the warmth find her skin. Somewhere above her, a chandelier hummed faintly with its own weight. She could hear it, the air around it slightly different, the way crystal moves sound around itself. This was the part she never told people about. The half-second after she crossed a threshold like this one, when she had to rebuild an entire room from sound alone. Footsteps told her the floor was marble and went on longer than it should. A string quartet, somewhere off to her left, was playing something old and unhurried, the kind of music meant for people who had never once had to count their steps to stay upright. She let her shoulders drop a fraction. Whatever this place was, it was warm and it was dry, and for a moment that felt like enough. She didn't know yet that she'd just walked into the middle of something far worse than rain. Across the lobby, Elijah Robinson was already watching her. He had not meant to be standing there. He had come down the staircase mid-argument with Soren, his captain, the two of them still sharp from a meeting that had not gone the way either of them wanted, when something in the room changed, a pull he felt before he understood it, low in his chest, old and specific. He had felt it exactly once before, a decade ago, standing over a grave he hadn't been allowed to grieve at properly. He told himself it wasn't possible. He started walking toward the doors anyway. Convoy's already moving, Soren said beside him. Voice clipped, eyes scanning the room out of old habit. We should be in it. Elijah didn't answer. He was looking at the woman by the entrance, soaked through, cane sweeping the floor in front of her in small, practiced arcs, utterly unaware that 6 men had just shifted their weight toward her without being told to. Hailie took a step toward where she guessed a front desk might be. Her boot found the one stretch of marble the rain had carried in from outside, and the floor simply wasn't there anymore. She didn't have time to brace. Her case threw her balance sideways, her hands came up on instinct, and instead of the floor she hit something that didn't move. Warm, solid, immovable, smelling faintly of rain and cedar and something underneath that she had no name for. Her cane clattered away across the marble, the sound enormous in a room that had gone, without warning, completely silent. Then came the small mechanical sound she knew from a different kind of life entirely. Metal sliding against metal. More than one. Don't move. A man's voice. Close, low, controlled in a way that made it worse. She felt the air around her change shape, bodies repositioning, a kind of a tension with weight to it. She couldn't see the guns. She didn't need to. She could hear 6 different breathing patterns settle into the same rhythm, and underneath the rain still clinging to her jacket, she could smell gun oil, sharp and cold, layered over expensive cologne. Her mind told her to apologize, to explain, to make herself smaller. Her body did something else entirely. She stood very still, chin lifted, the old discipline of 10 years rising in her before she had decided to let it. Some part of her cataloged the room the way she hadn't let herself catalog a room in years. The exact distance to the door behind her, the weight distribution of the man whose chest she'd struck, the half-second of hesitation in the breathing to her left that meant that one would move first. She told herself this was only instinct. She had told herself that for a decade. The hand at her shoulders, the one she'd collided into, hadn't let go. Stand down. The same low voice, but aimed elsewhere now, and the room obeyed it instantly. She heard the small metallic retreat of weapons being lowered, one after another, like a held cord finally resolving. "I'm sorry," she said, and hated how thin it sounded. "I couldn't see the—" "I know." 2 words, nothing more, but something in the way he said them stopped the rest of her sentence in her throat. His hand moved from her shoulder to her jaw, not rough, not asking permission either, tilting her face slightly, as if he were reading something written there only he could see. She should have pulled away. She had spent a decade perfecting the reflex that would have done it: flinch, step back, become unremarkable again. She didn't move. His thumb found the old scar under her jaw, the one from a crash she didn't remember and a surgery she'd been too young to consent to, and his breath changed. Just slightly. Just enough that she heard it. "Say something," she whispered. "Tell me why everyone in this room is afraid of you." He didn't answer that question. He bent down instead, his mouth close enough to her ear that she felt the words before she fully heard them, and he said the one word her father had spent his whole short, careful life making sure she never had to. Kin. The word landed somewhere underneath her ribs and stayed there. She had built an entire life out of being unremarkable, out of being the quiet woman with a violin case who never asked for help she didn't strictly need, who had made peace, she told herself, with being someone nobody looked at twice. And here was a stranger with guns trained on him a moment ago, holding her face like it belonged to him, calling her something her father had died protecting her from ever hearing. Somewhere behind her, the captain's voice, careful now. Elijah. Who is she? Hailie felt the answer before it came, not in the air, but in her own chest, in the small, unfamiliar warmth unculling low behind her sternum, equal parts terror and recognition. She did not know this man's name yet. Some older, quieter part of her already did. "She's the reason," Elijah said. "We're still at war." Nobody in the room moved. Somewhere far above them, the storm threw itself against glass that didn't so much as shudder. Hailie stood inside the silence that followed his words, aware of her own pulse in a way she hadn't been in years, aware of the warmth of his hand still resting along her jaw like he had no intention of explaining himself further tonight, or maybe ever. She had spent a decade learning exactly how much of herself to show a room. Tonight, without deciding to, without understanding why, she had shown this stranger something she hadn't shown anyone since she was 17 years old, and he hadn't flinched. He had looked, if anything, like a man who had been waiting a very long time to see it. The rain kept hammering the windows behind her, and for the first time in 10 years, Hailie McCall did not know which direction safety was in. Her hand found the door handle of the car before she'd agreed to get in it. The metal was cold under her palm, slicked with rain, and for a moment that small physical fact was the only thing she could hold on to. Everyone else moved like this was settled. Soren had already opened the rear door. The driver hadn't asked her name. Elijah stood close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him through the wet air, waiting, patient in a way that unsettled her more than urgency would have. "I have a life," she said. "People expect me places. I have a rehearsal Thursday. You won't make Thursday if you walk out of this lobby alone." He didn't say it cruelly. That was the part she couldn't get past. No threat in his voice at all, only the flat certainty of a man stating tomorrow's weather. She had spent a decade learning to read the difference between a person trying to frighten her and a person simply telling her the truth. This was the second kind. She hated how easily she could still tell. She got in the car. The door sealed behind her with a sound too solid for an ordinary vehicle, and the storm outside went distant, muffled. Someone else's problem. Elijah settled across from her, unhurried, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She listened to the engine, quieter than it should have been, and to his breathing, slow, deliberate, the breathing of a man who had learned a long time ago not to let his body give anything away. "You're going to tell me who you are," she said. "Not what room you own. Who you are." "I'm the reason your father is dead." She had braced for many things getting into that car. Not that. "My father died in a car accident," she said, and heard, even as she said it, how worn the words were, how many times she'd repeated them to strangers who needed a short answer and never once asked herself if they were true. "I was 12. There was ice on the road." There was no ice. The car merged into traffic, smooth, unhurried, while something in her chest refused to move at all. "His name was Colin Robinson," Elijah said. "He was my brother. Before he was your father, he was the man people in my world feared crossing, until he gave it up. All of it. The name, the standing, the protection that came with both, because he loved a woman the old families had decided he wasn't allowed to love. They called it a debt. A father had no right to spend his bloodline on his own happiness. He spent it anyway." Hailie sat very still, the way she'd learned to sit when a teacher told her something about her body she didn't want to hear, the way she'd sat in hospital rooms at 12 years old being told what 12-year-old eyes don't recover from. The leather under her hands had gone warm where she gripped it. Somewhere beneath the engine's quiet hum, she could hear her own pulse, steady and far too loud, and underneath that, faintly, the particular smell of him, rain and cedar, and something colder she still didn't have a name for, something that made the small hairs along her arms rise without her permission. "That's not him," she said. "That's not the man who taught me scales until my fingers bled. Who used to." Her voice caught somewhere she didn't expect it to. "He read me the same 3 books 100 times because I liked the sound of his voice doing the different parts." "He was both," Elijah said. "That was the danger of him. Men like that don't choose one life and discard the other. He carried what he was into the life he built with your mother, every day, and he carried it well enough that you never had to know. Until tonight. Until tonight." The car slowed for a light it didn't need to obey, the driver clearly choosing caution over speed, and in the silence that followed, Hailie became aware of her own hands, pressed flat against her knees, fingers spread, the posture of someone bracing for impact that had already happened. "The accident," she said low. "Tell me." "It wasn't an accident. A family we call the Salazars came to collect what they believed your father still owed them. He didn't have it to give, so they took the road from him instead." Elijah's voice didn't rise. If anything had dropped, "Careful now," the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed a sentence too many times alone and still can't make it sound easy. "Your mother didn't survive the night. Your father survived 3 days. Long enough to make me promise something I have spent 10 years trying to be enough to keep." Hailie's throat worked around a sound she didn't let out. "You've been watching me," she said. "This whole time. Every birthday. Every recital I thought no one came to. Every year of it. Why? Because the debt didn't die with him." He let that sit a moment before he finished it. "It came to you." The word landed somewhere she hadn't braced for, somewhere underneath the grief, in the part of her that had spent a decade quietly cataloging rooms and counting exits without asking herself why a violinist would need either skill. She opened her mouth to ask what kind of debt follows a daughter who plays weddings and inherits nothing but an apartment and a careful, ordinary life. The privacy glass between them and the driver lowered an inch, unbidden. "Boss." Soren's voice, tight in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. "We have a problem at the East Gate. Someone's already there. Says they're family." Elijah went very still beside her, the stillness of a man recalculating an entire evening in half a second. "Whose family?" he asked, and something in the question made the hair lift along Hailie's arms before she understood why. "Yours," Soren said. "Says her name's McCall." Hailie felt the floor of every story she'd ever told herself about her own life give way at once. She had no living family that carried that name. She had buried both of her parents at 12 years old in a single week, and never once, in 10 years, had anyone come looking for her using a name that belonged only to the four of them. The car went silent except for the rain, and underneath that, the small, unbearable sound of Elijah Robinson exhaling like a man who had just watched his careful plan come apart in real time. "That's not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Hailie sat in the dark of the car with her father's real name still settling into her bones, the rain ticking against the glass beside her like something counting down, and understood, with a certainty she had no language for yet, that whatever comfortable story she had been telling herself about who she'd lost, and how, had just ended for good. If you've stayed this long, you already know this isn't a story about being saved. Kindly subscribe before you go any further, because there's more of her waiting on the other side of what comes next, and if you leave now, you'll miss the part where she stops pretending. Soren came back to the car alone. "Gone," he said, sliding into the front seat, rain dripping off his collar. "Didn't wait around once the gate cameras came up. Left nothing but a print on the call box and a name that doesn't exist in any system we run." Elijah's jaw worked once, twice, before he spoke. "Salazar testing the perimeter. Using her name to see who answers it." Hailie sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way she'd once turned over a difficult passage of music, looking for the part that didn't resolve cleanly. Someone, somewhere in the dark, already knew enough about her to use her dead mother's maiden name as a key. She filed the fear away the way she'd learned to file everything, quietly, without letting it show on her face, and said nothing else for the rest of the drive. The estate, when they finally reached it, didn't sound like a fortress. It sounded like a held breath. Gravel under tires gave way to something smoother, and the air through the cracked window carried pine and cold water and the particular hush of a property large enough that the city noise simply gave up trying to reach it. Inside, the house settled around her in layers. Stone floors that returned sound differently than the marble had. A staircase wide enough that her footsteps echoed twice before they died. Somewhere above, a window left open to the storm, curtains breathing in and out against the frame like something alive. She let a woman named Priya show her to a room that smelled of cedar and clean linen, and when the door closed she stood very still in the middle of it for a long time, doing nothing at all. Not crying. Not thinking exactly. Just standing, one hand still curled loosely around the strap of a violin case she hadn't let anyone carry for her, while the last hour rearranged itself slowly into something she could hold. The rain had thinned to something softer against the window, and underneath it she could hear the house itself settling, old wood ticking somewhere, a pipe somewhere else, the particular hush of a building that had stood through more storms than this one and knew it would stand through more. She didn't sleep. She played instead. 3 days folded into each other after that, gentler than she expected and stranger for it. Meals appeared without her asking. No one raised their voice. No one explained anything she hadn't already pieced together herself, and she found, against every instinct she owned, that she didn't push. She told herself she was simply too tired to fight a house this quiet. She knew, underneath that, it was something closer to relief, the unfamiliar luxury of not having to be the only person keeping watch. Elijah found her on the third evening in the room with the long windows, mid-phrase, bow still moving though her hand had gone unsteady somewhere in the second movement. "Don't stop on my account," he said from the doorway. "I wasn't going to." She kept playing. It was easier than looking at where his voice had come from, easier than admitting how aware she'd become, over 3 days, of the particular quality of silence right before he entered a room, a stillness that arrived a half-second ahead of him, like the air itself knew first. He didn't sit. He didn't pace, the way she'd noticed he did most nights, footsteps measured and constant on the floor above her room until well past midnight. He simply stood in the doorway and listened, and she let the piece run longer than it needed to, testing what would happen if she didn't perform for him, didn't soften it, didn't make herself smaller to fit whatever he expected a blind girl in his house to sound like. When she finished, he didn't praise her. "Your father used to hum that one."
Badly.
He never could hold the third movement. Something in her chest came loose at that, small, involuntary, nothing she'd given permission for. He hummed everything badly. He thought it counted as singing. It didn't. "No," she agreed, and felt her own mouth do something it hadn't done in 3 days. It really didn't. For a moment the house held them both in something that wasn't quite peace, and wasn't quite danger either. Just two people who had each, separately, spent a decade missing the same man. Finding out the missing was easier shared. The bow rested against her knee now, forgotten, and she was aware of the particular weight of his attention in a way she hadn't let herself notice in 3 days, the way a room changes temperature when someone in it stops pretending to look away. She thought, with a part of her mind that never fully stopped working, that she could stay in this exact silence a long while and not call it captivity. She told herself she still wanted to leave. She didn't move toward the door. The sound that broke it was small. A phone, somewhere down the hall. Then Soren's voice, low and fast. Then footsteps that didn't belong to the slow rhythm of this house at all. Elijah's whole posture changed before he said a word. The careful stillness she'd been learning to read for 3 days replaced by something coiled, ready. Salazar's moved on the warehouses past the river road, hard. Soren said from the doorway, not waiting to be invited in. Real this time. Not a probe. How many? Enough that you need to be there. Elijah didn't look away from her right away. When he finally did, something in his face had closed, carefully, the way a door closes when someone doesn't want you to hear what happens on the other side of it. "I have to go," he said. "I know." She did know. She hated how plainly she knew it. "Garrick stays with you. He's the only man in this house I trust with you besides myself." A pause, brief, waited. "Lock the east wing if anything feels wrong. Trust what your body tells you before your manners do." It was an odd thing to say to a woman he believed had only ever lived as helpless. She heard it anyway, filed it away, with everything else she wasn't yet supposed to understand about herself. He was gone within minutes. A door, a car, the gravel swallowing the sound of him whole, and the house exhaled around her the way it had the first night, except this time there was no one left in it whose footsteps she already trusted. Garrick's were unfamiliar. Heavier than Soren's. Unhurried in a way that didn't match the rest of the house's careful quiet, each step landing a beat too slow, as though he were pacing himself against something only he could hear. She stood at the long windows, listening to him cross the hall behind her, and understood, with the same instinct that had once told her exactly where a stranger's gun was aimed, that whatever waited in this house tonight had not finished introducing itself. She didn't turn around when he stopped behind her. That was the first thing she noticed about herself, how easily the old performance came back, the soft slope of her shoulders, the slight tremor she let live in her hands without asking them to. She'd spent 3 days forgetting she needed it. Her body remembered before she did. The window glass was cool against her fingertips where she'd rested them without thinking, and beneath that coolness, she could feel the storm's last push against the frame, steady now, almost gentle, nothing like the version that had driven her through the doors of that hotel 4 nights ago.
4 nights.
It felt longer. It felt, in the part of her chest she didn't examine too closely, like the only honest stretch of time she'd had in years. Quite a house, isn't it? Garrick's voice had a different shape than it had in the hallway earlier, looser now, almost familiar, the kind of voice men used when they thought no one important was listening. Quite a man, too. Once you get past the suits and the speeches. He's been kind to me. He's been careful with you. There's a difference. She let that sit. Outside, the storm had thinned to something steady and patient, water finding its rhythm against the long windows, and underneath it she could hear him shift his weight from one foot to the other, twice, the small restlessness of a man deciding something he'd already decided days ago. "You don't sound like a man who works for him," she said. "I sound like a man who's tired of working for anyone." A pause, and in it she caught the faint metallic scent of gun oil again, the same smell from the lobby, closer now than it should have been. "3 days I've watched him circle you like you're something he's not allowed to touch. Watched him leave a fortune's worth of security on a girl who plays weddings. I used to think it was sentiment. Then I did the math." "What math?" "Renzo Salazar's math. He's been offering a number for your location since the night you walked into that hotel. A number that doesn't change whether you're found alive or otherwise." His footsteps started again, slow, unhurried, the same mismatched rhythm she'd clocked at the window. "I called it in an hour after the boss left. He'll be here within the night." The words landed somewhere she expected them to land, and somewhere she didn't. She had known, in the careful, cataloging part of her mind, that a house this guarded couldn't stay safe forever. She had not let herself know it would be the man left to protect her who opened the door. "Why?" she said, and kept her voice thin, kept it trembling, kept every old habit intact even as something underneath them went very still and very cold. "Because men like Elijah Robinson get to keep kingdoms. Men like me get to keep watch over them." He was close now. Close enough that she could feel the change in air pressure before his hand found her arm. Not gentle, not asking. "You're going to come with me quietly. Renzo doesn't want a scene. He wants what your father owed him, and you're the only ledger that's left." Her arm went rigid under his grip. "I don't know anything about a debt," she said, and even as the words left her she heard how worn they sounded, the same line she'd used on Elijah in the lobby a lifetime ago. "I play weddings. I play funerals when the money's good enough." That's the whole of it. That's what he told you to say, or that's what you've told yourself so long you believe it. Garrick's thumb pressed harder against the inside of her arm, testing. "Doesn't matter which. Renzo doesn't need you to know what you are. He just needs you delivered." This was the part where the old story said she should cry, beg, make herself smaller until he believed the danger was over. She had performed it 100 times in 100 rooms that weren't this one, and her mouth even opened to start the familiar shape of it. And then something else answered first. It came up from low in her chest, not a thought, not a decision, something older than either, a sound, faint, almost beneath hearing, that didn't belong to a frightened woman in a borrowed house. She felt it before she understood what it was. A vibration along her sternum, a tightening behind her eyes that had nothing to do with tears. Garrick felt it too. His grip loosened, just slightly, just enough that she registered the change. "What was that?" he said, and for the first time his voice didn't sound careless at all. She didn't answer. She was too busy listening to her own body do something she had spent 10 years training it not to do. Every sound in the house suddenly too sharp, too close, the particular creak of the floorboard under his left foot, the uneven catch in his breathing, the smell of him laid out in layers she had no language for and didn't need one to read. Her father's voice came to her from somewhere very far back, a memory she hadn't let herself reach for in years. "Not yet, little wolf. Not until you have no other choice left." She had told herself for a decade that she did have a choice, that choosing stillness, choosing smallness, choosing the careful performance of helplessness was its own kind of strength. Standing in a stranger's grip with her location already sold to a man who wanted her dead either useful or not, she understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and without permission, that she had simply been waiting for a room where the other choice finally made sense. "Let go of my arm," she said, and her voice had changed too, quieter, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there a minute ago, something that made Garrick's hand twitch like he'd touched a live wire. "Or what?" he said, but the careless confidence in it had gone thin. She didn't answer him with words. Her breath went low and even, the trembling gone from it entirely, replaced by something that moved through her chest like a current finding its circuit after years of being switched off. Somewhere beneath her collarbone, a sound began to build that wasn't fear and had never once, in 10 years, been allowed to finish forming. Not a growl exactly, not yet, but close enough to one that Garrick took an involuntary step back, his grip finally breaking from her arm entirely. For the first time since the lobby, since the car, since the long quiet nights of this borrowed house, Hailie McCall did not feel like the thing everyone in the room had decided she was. She felt, for the first time in 10 years, like herself, awake in a way that had nothing to do with eyes, and everything to do with finally letting something old and patient inside her stand up. Garrick didn't run.
He should have.
He reached instead for the gun at his hip, and Hailie was already moving before her mind caught up with a decision. Not blind groping, not the careful, practiced navigation she'd spent 10 years perfecting, but something faster, surer, her body reading the room the way it had always wanted to and never been allowed. She heard the holster open.
She was already inside his reach.
Her hand closed over his wrist before the weapon cleared leather, and the strength in her grip surprised them both, his more than hers. Bone met bone with a small, definite sound, and the gun dropped to the floorboard somewhere behind her, forgotten, while Garrick made a noise low in his throat that hadn't been part of his plan for tonight at all. "What are you?" he said, and there was nothing careless left in it now. She didn't answer. Answering wasn't the part of her that had woken up. It was over faster than either of them expected. A turn of her hip, his own momentum used against him, the particular satisfaction of a decade of restraint finally given somewhere useful to go. He hit the floor hard enough that the windows shivered in their frames, and she was on him before he could find his breath again, her knee at his sternum, his own belt already working its way out of its loops in her hands. She bound his wrists with the same steady patience she used tuning a stubborn string. Not cruel, not gentle either. Simply final. When it was done, she sat back on her heels in the quiet that followed and let herself feel, for one long moment, what her body had just done without asking her permission first. Her pulse was even. Her breathing had already settled. The only thing that hadn't gone quiet was the low hum still living somewhere behind her ribs, patient now, satisfied, the way a held note finally allowed to resolve. The room smelled of rain still drying on her jacket, and underneath that, faintly, the particular metal scent of someone else's fear, not her own, for once, and she let herself notice the difference the way she'd once let herself notice the first warm room after a storm. She had spent 10 years afraid of this exact stillness. She found, kneeling on a stranger's floor with another man's blood drying on her knuckles, that it felt instead like coming home to a house she'd locked herself out of on purpose. The front door opened hard enough to crack against the wall. "Hailie," Elijah's voice, already moving through the house before he finished the word, footsteps taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found the doorway and stopped there completely, one hand still braced against the frame, and for a long moment he simply looked. Garrick on the floor, bound, breathing but barely. Hailie standing over him, posture entirely without apology, blood not her own marking her hands, her face turned toward the door with the particular stillness of someone who had stopped performing for an audience and had no intention of starting again. "He sold me," she said, before Elijah could ask. "An hour after you left. Renzo's on his way." Elijah crossed the room slowly, the way a man approaches something he isn't certain is real. "You did this." "I did this. Alone. I've always been alone with it." Her voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 20 minutes, and she found, saying the words out loud for the first time in 10 years, that she didn't want it to. "You spent a decade thinking you were protecting a girl who couldn't see a threat coming. I spent that same decade learning to be one before anyone could see me coming. Something moved across his face she hadn't heard in his voice before. Not disbelief exactly. Something closer to grief, wearing disbelief's shape. Your father never told me. My father spent his whole life making sure no one would look for what I am, including you. She let that land between them, unhurried, watching the words do their work. He didn't want me protected, Elijah. He wanted me hidden. There's a difference. You taught me that yourself 3 nights ago, standing in a doorway listening to me play. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that settled, slow and complete, the way snow settles on a field that's been waiting all season for it. What are you? He asked, quieter now, the question no longer an accusation.
Both, she said.
His blood and my mother's both, in the same body, for the first time anyone's managed it. He used to call me his little wolf when he thought I was asleep. I always assumed he meant it the way fathers mean things they don't expect their daughters to remember. She looked toward him, toward the place she knew his face would be, though she would never see it the way he saw her.
He meant it exactly.
He spent his last 3 days making sure I'd survive long enough to find that out on my own terms, in my own time, instead of being told. Elijah didn't move for a long moment. When he finally crossed the last of the distance between them, he didn't reach for her face the way he had in the lobby, careful, claiming, a man marking something he intended to keep. This time his hand found hers instead, open, waiting to be taken or refused. She took it. 10 years, he said low. 10 years I told myself I was keeping a promise to a dead man. I never once let myself ask what it cost you to let me believe it. You weren't supposed to know yet. I know now. Somewhere behind them, Garrick stirred against his bindings and went still again, and neither of them turned to look. Outside, the storm that had carried her into that lobby 4 nights ago had finally thinned into something almost gentle, rain falling steady and unhurried against glass that had, for the first time all night, stopped feeling like the edge of a cage. Renzo's coming, she said. Tonight. Let him come. Elijah's grip on her hand tightened, not in warning this time, but in something closer to relief. He spent 10 years hunting a debt he thinks is owed to him. He has no idea what's standing on the other side of it now. Hailie felt the word rise in her chest before she let it reach her mouth, not the one he'd given her in the lobby, claiming, possessive, a stranger's certainty about a woman he barely knew. This one was hers to give now, earned the long way, spoken on her own terms to a man who had finally stopped trying to keep her safe, by keeping her small.
Kin, she said.
And for the first time since the night her father died, the word didn't sound like something she had to survive. It sounded like something she had finally, fully, chosen to keep, hers now in her own voice, given instead of taken. Renzo Salazar arrived an hour before dawn and never made it past the gate. Hailie heard it the way she heard everything now, clearly, completely, without having to strain for a single piece of it. Tires on gravel, raised voices that didn't last long, a silence afterward that told her more than any report would have. She stood at the long windows of the room where she'd first played for Elijah, listening to the sound of a decade-old threat and somewhere she couldn't see and didn't need to, and felt nothing she recognized as triumph. Just the particular quiet of a debt finally closed. The violin case still sat against the wall where she'd left it 3 nights ago, untouched since the night everything in this house had changed shape. She didn't reach for it now either. There would be time for that. For the first time in 10 years, she let herself believe there would simply be time. Elijah came to find her once it was finished, his footsteps slower than she'd ever heard them, a man walking into a room he wasn't certain he was allowed in anymore. It's done, he said. Whatever's left of the Red Clan will spend the next year deciding whether coming for you is worth what it cost them tonight. And if they decide it was, then they'll learn what I already know. A pause, careful, the kind he hadn't needed with her until tonight. That I was never the dangerous one in this house. She let that sit between them, unhurried, the way she'd learned to let the truest things sit before reaching for them. Outside, the sky had started to lighten at its edges, not sunrise yet, just the first softening of a night that had gone on long enough to feel like its own small life. "You knew," she said. "Not everything. But you knew there was more to me than a violin case and a white cane. You've known for years." He didn't deny it. She would have heard the lie in his breathing if he had. "I knew your father bred something into your blood the old families had never seen, and would have killed you for the moment they understood it," he said. "I knew if I told you what you were, you'd want to use it. And some part of me, the part I'm not proud of, wanted you to need me a while longer before you found out you didn't." The honesty of it landed harder than any blow Garrick had thrown. "That's not protection," she said quietly. "That's loneliness wearing protection's clothes. I know that now, too."
Do you?
She let the question sit, sharper than she meant it, though she didn't soften it after. Because it's easy to say that the morning after, standing in a house that's already safe. "I want to know if you'd have said it 3 nights ago, before you watched what I could do to a man who underestimated me." He didn't answer right away, and the silence told her more than a quick reassurance would have. "No," he admitted finally. 3 nights ago, I still believed I could keep choosing what you knew about yourself. Tonight, I learned I never had that right to begin with." She turned toward him fully then, the way she rarely did with anyone, letting him see whatever her face was doing, without softening at first. 10 years I thought I had to choose between being safe and being known. You let me believe that because the alternative meant admitting you needed someone enough to be afraid of losing them. Yes. No defense in it. No explanation reaching to soften the word. Just the plain shape of a man finally setting something down he'd carried so long he'd forgotten its weight had a name. "I have run this territory for a decade without once needing another living soul, Hailie." And then a blind woman with a violin case walked into my lobby and I understood, inside one breath, that I had been lying to myself about that for exactly as long as I'd been lying to you. The silence that followed wasn't strategic this time. It was simply 2 people standing inside the truth long enough to let it become real. She thought of the decade of recitals played to empty rooms she'd assumed were empty, the anonymous scholarships, the careful, unseen hand behind every soft landing her life had somehow always managed to find. She thought of how long she'd told herself that being unremarkable was its own kind of safety, and how much smaller that safety had been than the thing standing in front of her now, finally honest, finally afraid of the right things. "I'm not going back to hiding," she said. "Not the violin case version of myself, not the helpless one. Not for you, and not for whatever's left of the families who think a debt like mine ever really closes. I wouldn't ask you to." His hand found hers again, the same open offering as before, and this time neither of them hesitated over it. "I don't want the girl I thought I was protecting. I haven't, if I'm honest, in longer than I let myself admit." "What do you want?"
"You."
"As you actually are. Whatever that costs me to keep standing next to." Somewhere beyond the estate's gates, the city was waking into an ordinary Tuesday morning. Traffic, coffee, people who would never know how close their quiet day had come to ending differently. Hailie thought, distantly, of the other women out there she would likely never meet, the ones who carried inheritances like hers without a house this safe to wake up inside, without anyone left standing close enough to finally say her name and mean all of it. She hoped, in the private place she kept hopes she rarely spoke aloud, that some of them found their way to a morning like this one too, and that the ones who hadn't yet were still out there fighting toward it. For now there was only this, the smell of rain finally finished falling, the particular warmth of a hand that had stopped trying to manage her and started simply choosing her, and the quiet, settled certainty that she had spent 10 years surviving a story that was only now, finally, beginning to belong to her.
"Say it again," she said.
"Not the way you said it the first night. Say it like you mean it this time." Elijah brought her hand to his mouth, unhurried, and when he spoke the word it carried none of the claiming weight it had in that lobby 4 nights ago, only the plain, unguarded truth of a man who had finally stopped being afraid of what it cost him to need someone.
Kin, he said.
And for the first time in either of their lives, the word didn't sound like a debt being paid. It sounded like home, finally, fully arrived at, not handed to her, not granted out of pity or convenience, but built the long way, out of everything it had cost both of them to get here. There are women in this world who were handed power they never asked for and spent years deciding what to do with it quietly, alone, before anyone else found out. If that's you, if some part of this found you the way it found her, subscribe and stay close. This is where we keep finding each other,